If you look at approval ratings for Andy Burnham, everyone knows that they're pretty good for him nationally, net positive, which is pretty unusual for a politician in these times. If Andy Burnham, possibly the strongest candidate available both locally and nationally, can't win in a seat like Makerfield, which is probably more Labour loyal than many of these kinds of seats, then Labour's crisis in this part of the world really is very deep indeed.
Winning the Makerfield by-election might not be as straightforward as Andy Burnham would like, and this is why. Hi everyone, Neil Patterson here, host of This Is Why, and what a week we have just had. We've seen the Prime Minister under pressure to resign, the Health Secretary actually doing so, and the latest developments, well, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, has found a friendly Labour MP to step down so that the Mayor can have a go at becoming Prime Minister. For the next few weeks, politics is going to revolve around the constituency of Makerfield. Once upon a time, this was, of course, the seat that Labour could win without having to try too hard. But recent election results suggest that Reform have a real chance, even if Andy Burnham is pretty popular in this part of the north. So, what do we know about Makerfield? And what will the eventual result tell us about where politics is going next? Rob Ford is Professor of Political Science at the University of Manchester.
Well, it's a really interesting seat, Neil. It's right on the edge of Greater Manchester. If you look at Greater Manchester on a map, it kind of has like a little arm that extends out westward. The westernmost bit of that little arm is Wigan Borough, and Makerfield is the southern half of that. So it's in Greater Manchester, but really not like Manchester. It's in Wigan Borough, but it's really not like Wigan itself. The people there don't consider themselves to be Wigan primarily or Manchester primarily. It's a former coal mining area. So in some respects, the local culture, smaller towns with very intense local identities that were built around pit heads or around individual industries. Now that industry's all gone, but the sort of fragmented nature of the place is rooted in that history. It is not at all like, for example, Gorton and Denton, where we had a by-election recently. It is not a city centre seat. It's a city fringe seat. It's kind of in that zone, where Greater Manchester shades out into Merseyside. Not really one, not really the other. Very powerful, prideful local industrial heritage, but hasn't necessarily, incidentally, shared in the prosperity that Manchester city centre has seen under Burnham and under his predecessors before devolution. So this is a really, really interesting seat. It's a real test. It's a real test because the local elections we saw here last week, very strong for Reform, possibly in part because of that fact that this is not necessarily a place that has experienced that renewal and resurgence that we do associate with what Andy Burnham has taken to calling Manchesterism.
We will, of course, come on to more recent political developments, but without meaning to use the shorthand, is this a sort of seat that previously you would have described as, in inverted commas, traditional Labour territory?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you go back in history in this seat, it's one of those places where to use the old proverb, they would have been weighing the Labour vote rather than counting it. Some of the results there, 60, 70, 80% Labour, partly reflecting, of course, the mining heritage earlier on. But even till quite recently in local council elections here, it's just very, very, very heavily Labour. This is not one of those red wall seats, quote unquote, that went to Johnson in 2019. It stayed with Labour all the way through. It stayed with Labour in 2024. So it is a very traditional Labour seat. And therefore, you would normally think, well, this is an ideal kind of parachute seat, safe seat, but politics is changing very fast. It doesn't necessarily look as safe right now.
In terms of the kind of the big political events that may well have shaped this community, I mean, what sort of impact did Brexit have? I mean, was this one of those Brexit supporting areas?
This is very heavily Leave area. This is definitely one of those places that is, traditionally Labour, traditionally Leave. But I think somewhere like Makerfield really underlines that sort of regional stereotype of the red wall that we all had from about 2016 through to about 2021. It masks a lot of variation. So, you'd have other seats, including in the Northwest, that went more heavily over to the Conservatives. This wasn't one such seat, even though it is a very heavily Leave voting area. Very white, very working class, very born in Britain, all of those kinds of things. Probably quite old, few graduates. Not you're not getting many of your sort of university educated social liberals around here or anything like that.
At least until the last couple of years. Again, this would be what you would call a safe seat. But you look around the election kind of map at the moment, and there aren't that many which Labour could genuinely say right now are safe.
Well, absolutely, Neil. I mean, we've had two Westminster by-elections up here in the northwest in the past couple of years. Runcorn and Helsby, which was 50% Labour, one of Labour's safest seats, they lost it. Gorton and Denton, which was more than 50% Labour, one of Labour's safest seats, they lost it. Makerfield is, on paper, a less safe seat than either of those in terms of the vote share that Labour received last time. So it is a risk. This is by no means an in-the-bag seat. So if you're Andy Burnham, you've got to gamble. And his whole pitch is, I am the guy who can win back the kinds of voters we're losing to reform. And in that respect, this is an ideal seat, because this is the kind of place where Labour have been losing a lot of support, particularly very recently, particularly under Keir Starmer, to reform. The Wigan results last week, I mean, it feels like a lot longer ago than last week, incidentally, Neil. Things are moving awfully fast. But last week in Wigan was a really terrible week for Labour. They got absolutely wiped out in the borough, including in all the wards that make up Makerfield constituency, lost every single one, and Reform were getting between 40 and 50% of the vote in all of those wards. But, and this is a really important but, I feel, go back 2 years earlier and look at the results in Wigan when the council elections were up then on the same day as Andy Burnham was on the ballot for the mayor of Greater Manchester. And Labour won all of these wards by similarly sort of stonking margins. So it is a tale of two elections. Which Makerfield is going to show up in a couple of months' time? Is it the Makerfield that showed such enthusiasm for Labour and Burnham in the mayoral elections of 2024 and the local elections held at the same time? Or is it going to be the Makerfield that showed up last week that is basically completely fed up and hacked off and anti the Labour government? It is going to be a real test of whether or not Andy Burnham his appeal round here really does completely transcend the rather bruised brand of the Labour Party.
But I wonder whether or not there may be some glimmer of hope for Andy Burnham, in the sense that, well, to what extent were those results of just a few days ago motivated by anti-Labour sentiment, or were they motivated by anti-Starmer sentiment?
Well, that is the question, I think. On balance, my hunch is it's more anti-Starmer than anti-Labour. I do think when you look at the scale and speed of the reform breakthrough, it's not like this is an area that's been voting reform for a long time. So it's not like it's an area that's sort of dead set against Labour for a longer period of time. So it does feel like the kind of place where perhaps what we were seeing last week, to some extent at least, was a sort of howl of protest at the disappointment that people have in the Starmer government. They thought they were electing a government that was going to deliver change for them. They don't really feel that change is happening, so they're not really very happy, and reform provides the really obvious outlet for expressing that kind of discontent. That is certainly what Andy Burnham will be hoping, of course, and ultimately it's very hard to know until we see what happens next. But we know it's not an entrenched reform vote because it's only really manifested last week. Those people have changed their minds before.
I mean, the kind of the Conservative collapse to reform that we have seen in other parts of the country, that's not going to be a big factor in and around this part of the world.
You've enabled me to really nerd out now cephalogically. I was literally just looking through the ward by ward results before I came on this call, because I know how to have fun on a Friday. What we're seeing is partly voters who are just sat out, coming off the fence and coming out to vote for reform, potentially protest vote for reform, but also all of the Conservative vote is gone. They go from like 20% plus in some wards to like 5% overnight. So reform have probably hoovered up a chunk of right vote at the same time as they're picking up a chunk of anti-Starmer Labour vote potentially. So there is more than one thing going on here, as there is practically everywhere in our fragmented politics. And you're absolutely right to pick up the Conservative vote. I mean, they look pretty much dead ducks around that part of Manchester now.
Okay, so enter stage left, or should that be enter stage soft left, Andy Burnham. I mean, how is he viewed in a constituency like Makerfield, given especially what you said to me originally, that this is not a place that is quite Wigan, that is quite Greater Manchester, and Andy Burnham is a man who has very firmly planted his feet in Manchester.
Yeah, he is Mr. Manchester, of course. That's the way he's pitched himself, and sort of very much, the King of the North, standing up for Manchester against the Westminster establishment and all this. So he's got a very populist narrative that he's built around himself, which has really endeared him to the people around here. I mean, first point, with my sort of polling analysis hat on, if you look at approval ratings for Andy Burnham, everyone knows that they're pretty good for him nationally, net positive, which is pretty unusual for a politician in these times. But they're really, really good up here in the Northwest. One statistic that I believe Mr. Burnham likes to tout is that I think he won every single ward but one in the 2024 mayoral election across all 10 boroughs of Greater Manchester. Part of his political project has been being the mayor for everyone, broad appeal, not just sort of narrow appeal. So that's definitely going to stand him in good stead in a place like this. The other thing that may help him is his personal backstory. He is from this part of the world, not literally Makerfield, but not so far away. He represented Lee constituency for a number of years, which is just nearby. He grew up not so far from here as well. So he knows this kind of place. He knows these kinds of people. He can go around here and say, I'm one of you, and I will be one of you in Westminster. I'll be one of you potentially in Downing Street. I'll be your voice around the tables of power. And that's a much more credible message coming from someone who's literally grown up here than it would be from someone who's come in from outside.
Totally, but it's a credible message only if you entirely believe the political journey that Andy Burnham has been on since he was, an MP in Westminster. I mean, I remember covering him back when he used to work around these parts, and he was a dyed-in-the-wool Blairite.
That's true. That part of his political history, it would be hard to use it against him, I suspect, in a current campaign, because his time as mayor just looms so large. I was reading through some focus group stuff that I think More in Common has done in communities in the Makerfield seat, and people will spontaneously bring up, him standing up for Manchester, him standing up for GM, him doing his bit for the city. Now, the kind of CV of policy achievements that people can spontaneously reel off isn't necessarily huge, but the
bus prices,
buses and bus prices, and that's big in many parts of Manchester. But let's remember, not necessarily in Makerfield, which is a commuter place. It's very high car ownership, not on the tram network. Most people, if they're going into Manchester, they're getting in by car. So if anything, the decision that he made that's most important for him with voters around here is not bringing in the clean air zone, because this is the kind of place where car commuters would have been very hacked off about that. So the policy side of it is a mixed bag. People can point to one or two highly symbolic things. Andy Burnham's actually been very good at finding highly symbolic policies that stick in people's memory. But the bigger story, which has been the Burnham project, is people see him as one of us, as sticking up for us, as personifying and representing one place very effectively within a political system that many people around this part of the world feel often neglects them. And that will be very much the message that he seeks to bring to Makerfield. And I think it will be very hard to try and combat that with, but in 2007 you were wandering around as a spad in Westminster. He'll just say, well, we all make mistakes in our youth.
Still, I do wonder whether there might be two sides to that coin. On the one hand, obviously, you have the authenticity that, really interestingly, these kind of devolved positions have given a select group of politicians. On the other side, though, Jess Phillips, his Labour colleague, herself possessed of a regional accent, warning that he needs to not look too entitled as he enters into this race. I mean, if he acts as if it's a shoo-in, it certainly won't be.
You're right, and I think Burnham is well aware of that. I think he knows his patch in terms of GM, and he knows Makerfield is not by any means a done deal. I think he knows he has to be humble and he has to work for every single vote in there. I think it's absolutely right that it would be political entitlement would be political kryptonite. Let's not also forget that the reason the MP who's vacating this seat, Josh Simons, it was a classic parachute narrative. He was sort of brought in to the seat at the very last minute after the previous MP retired, imposed by the NEC. He really has no connections to the area whatsoever. I'm sure there are quite a lot of voters who are still fairly hacked off and resentful about that. So this is a sensitive issue in general, but particularly in a seat that has recent experience of a kind of political entitlement narrative. So I think you're absolutely right. He will need to get his head down and work very hard for every single vote. I don't know if Jess Phillips is also referring to what comes after, but I think you're also right that within Labour, once he gets to Westminster, he can't just sweep in and assume that the crown is his. He's then going to have to work very hard for every MP's vote, potentially every member's vote. There's a long way to go in all of this.
What might we ultimately learn from the Makerfield election result? I mean, look, if Labour are to stand any chance of remaining in power after the next general election, they need to win the Liberal cities. They need to get back some of the reform vote. They need to appeal to the old working class communities that, frankly, for a number of years, Labour seems to have taken advantage. I mean, what is the insight that we will get from a yes or no to Andy Burnham in this particular seat?
I think we will get a very strong signal about whether or not renewal in government is possible for this Labour government in the sort of white working class leave voting seats, of which Makerfield is a classic example. If Andy Burnham, possibly the strongest candidate available both locally and nationally, can't win in a seat like Makerfield, which is probably more Labour loyal than many of these kinds of seats, then Labour's crisis in this part of the world really is very deep indeed. It would be very hard to see a path to renewal or redemption in this part of the world if someone like Burnham can't win somewhere like Makerfield. The other side of the coin is, because it's probably a relatively easy reach, it doesn't necessarily tell us that renewal is possible everywhere, but it at least means that the necessary condition for renewal, that at least somebody popular locally, popular nationally, can get a hearing from these voters and they can have their minds changed about this Labour government. It's a start, but it won't be the finish of the process. But if Burnham loses in this seat, not only is that probably the end of his political career for the time being, but it potentially signals the long-term demise of Labour in places like that. Because if Burnham can't do it here, I'm not sure what Labour figure can do it in this part of the world.
See, Rob, it was at this point in our chat that I was going to ask you very directly if you thought Labour still spoke the language of places like Makerfield. But the more I think about that question, I'm not so sure what it means. Is that to do with the policies? Does Labour have the policy portfolio that is attractive to places like this? Or is there a problem that in Keir Starmer, perhaps not with Andy Burnham, you have a technocrat that is incapable of articulating those policies?
I really think that one of the underestimated skills in politics, and one which we've seen through its absence being so painful for Labour under Starmer, is storytelling. You have to tell voters a story about who you are and who they are and how you represent them and how you are taking them somewhere they want to go. You have to offer them a story about the past, the present, the future, where the country's going to go, where the community's going to go. And I tell you, as someone who's lived in Greater Manchester for a long time now, Andy Burnham has got a lot better at that kind of storytelling skill. He was a technocrat, policy first kind of guy 20 years ago. Now he understands that the centre of all politics is telling a story. Who are we? Where are we going? I don't think Keir Starmer has ever really had that talent. Even when he was in opposition, I think people accepted that this was an element that they didn't have a lot to work with. They tried, they did their best, but it wasn't really his skill set. And I think it will almost be an interesting case study in, you know, what you can get through narrative and story and identity-based biographical-based politics, as opposed to just policy agenda politics, if we go from a Starmer leadership to a Burnham leadership, because I think the style of politics would be very different under Burnham.
I understand that this one is difficult to call. It is going to be difficult, but certainly not impossible for Andy Burnham to take the seat, to get back into Westminster.
If push came to shove, I think that I always have to go on the numbers, Neil. That's what I'm here for, right? And the numbers say Burnham should be favourite. His record in mayoral election results in this borough and this area, incredibly strong. So you'd have to say, on balance, he must go into this favourite. This is not an area it's not like he's trying to take, a deep blue seat and swing it back to Labour, having gone for 10 years. This is a place that was still Labour, and pretty strongly so, even in 2024. So I would have to say it's advantage Burnham going into this. But the flip side of that is, do I think a reform win here is inconceivable? Absolutely not. Clearly from last week locals, we can see it. And if reform were to win here, then that really would be, in my view, one of the strongest piece of evidence yet that they really could be a party that can push Labour out of office and potentially push towards majority status themselves. This is not, by any stretch of the imagination, an easy win for them as an insurgent party, even given last week's local election results. To take out a figure of the stature of Burnham on his home turf would be a remarkable outcome. So, yeah, advantage Burnham, but for reform, so much to play for as well.
Thanks very much for being with us. We are back on Monday. Till then, have a great weekend.